All right, before we get started on today's episode of Chalk Talk, we have had a lot of great stuff coming out, from women in weights to different school spotlights to talking about things like eccentric training. Be sure to catch up on a lot of podcasts. I know a lot of people are working from home and doing things a little bit different with everything that's happening. We have lots of stuff that we're coming out and tons of resources we want to make available to all of you guys, no matter what your situation is. So Coach Brez has been working on plenty of stuff on that front as well. Given the time, given the nature, reach out to us, check everything out. We're here to help. We're here to be a partner with all the schools that we work with. So go check that out at pltforum.com, but don't hesitate to reach out to us in any form or fashion. We are on your team. So we are going to keep the ball rolling with our own podcast schedule. We are going to be going over injury prevention today. This is Chalk Talk presented by Platform. Let's go. All right, so we are going to jump into the topic of injury prevention, and it was something that I wanted to talk about because I think it gets talked about in two very different ways in the world of high school strength and conditioning and just strength and conditioning in general. So I will sort of just set the framework up of what I was thinking about, and then we can start to unpack it however you see fit. Yeah, cool. I think a lot of times people say, well, we do strength and conditioning for injury prevention. And I think some people, and I'll put them into two buckets, and I'm sure there's overlap here, will say we're doing it because we're doing kind of like pre-hab stuff or things that you can get done in the weight room that's going to prevent or help mitigate overuse injuries or things like that. And then the pure aspect of strength and conditioning to like strengthen muscles to avoid, and the one that you see thrown around there all the time are things like less ACL tears and like more like, singular events that happen on a field or on a game or a competition. So it's a huge topic to unpack. Those are the kind of the big takeaways that I think a lot of people start to try to assign injury prevention to in strength and conditioning. So I'll stop and let you take over and kind of set up the framework a little bit for where we'll go from there.
Okay, yeah, you're right. There is a lot to unpack when it comes to injury prevention because the long and short of it is both of those two statements or ideas or discussions are correct. And it's a much larger discussion in total, injury prevention is. So really, I think first setting the stage, we all know that injury while playing sport, being competitive, is an unavoidable in its most literal sense event. It'll happen. You could go play pickup basketball at 40 years old and roll an ankle, just as likely as you are to when you're playing in a competitive high school soccer season.
Sure.
So, injury will happen, and we know that that's a fact. That there are many different types of injury, and maybe what's best is to kind of look at. I like to think of it in the sense of two very distinct types of injury, both of which we can, to borrow your word, mitigate the risk of through what we do outside of the field of competition. So
Sure.
The first would be, think of it as like an acute or traumatic singular event, as you mentioned, injury, in which I like to think of it as you are either being contacted by somebody else, an external factor outside of your control. You are put in a position that is extreme, that is completely unintentional.
Yeah.
You land funny. You go up for a header in soccer and you come down on one leg and you're not even able, even if you know how to, land appropriately on that leg.
Right.
You are putting your body in a stressed position that's well beyond its ability to deal with. So, ACL injuries and ankle injuries, they're all to some degree preventable in the macro sense. But what I'm looking at is this type of injury we talk about, like we call it the acute or traumatic, the uncontrollable. To some degree, some things happen in the moment in such an extreme way that you can't really can't control it. I then kind of separate the rest of the injuries out as something that we can think of as preventable. That can be something as simple as, overuse or those singular events that might be not nearly as stressful or extreme that occur because your body cannot handle that given extra amount of stress, whereas somebody that has been prepared for it might be able to. Maybe you either instead of tearing an ACL, you strain some additional ligaments in the knee and there are no tears.
Yep.
Or an ankle roll becomes a slight strain or sprain versus a serious, walking in a boot type of injury for weeks. So these are the things that we're now talking about. How can we control, reduce, decrease the rate of incidence when you are in practice, in games, etc. So when we talk about injury today, those are really the ones I'm talking about. By no means am I saying, hey, if you do this, all ACLs are no longer a consideration, or ankle rolling is you're never gonna withstand or sustain an ankle injury. So
yeah, and I think to that, like almost what we're getting at, I don't know if this is the right way to say it, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is like the trained or prepared athlete for those situations is better off than someone who might have done no preparation whatsoever.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think next, the way you can identify where strength and conditioning or training or any sort of preparation or prevention modality works, or how could you apply it, you have to understand the different mechanisms for injury.
Yep. So
going into that, that I think is a very important next step to make. First and foremost, the first kind of factor that will always be at number one on the likelihood of injury is previous injury. So if you've already torn a hamstring, I know this very well, if you've already strained something, if you've already hurt something, your likelihood of re-injuring that particular area or part of the body is far more likely because of scar tissue issues and everything else, which we're not going to talk about it today, but it really signifies the importance of proper return to play protocols, actual recovery, rehab. Again, that's not necessarily the focal point of today, but making sure that athletes are completely recovered from previous injury is probably your best injury prevention strategy in total. That's more the athletic trainer role of the school, and most of us have great athletic trainers that are taking care of that. But that's something to note, that we're not going to necessarily talk about that today as strength and conditioning professionals or even athletic coaches. But that's a big piece of the puzzle.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's a good differentiation, because you're right. Like, there are a lot of times when we're talking about injury and you see the guy who's got a wrap this, a wrap that, and starts to compensate and lean on something else and have other problems like you talked about. So with that being said, we'll go kind of into maybe some of the, does it make sense to talk about some of the types of injuries, or does it make sense to talk about some of the other?
Maybe more like the factors. I mean, the types of injuries range across the board. We're talking, knee sprains, hamstring pulls, knee, anterior knee pain, kids that say that, the patella tendon area hurts, shin splints, rotator cuff injuries. That's why I wanted to kind of describe those two buckets of kind of more preventable versus non-preventable versus rather than acute versus overuse, because an acute injury like an ankle roll or a knee sprain is something that could theoretically be preventable, just like an overuse injury. What I don't want to say is there is the traumatic type of injury and overuse chronic injury, and only one of them can be prevented in a specific way. We do a lot of things that can work to prevent both. So it's more about what is the cause of the injury, what is the root cause. The first and foremost behind, I should say, the previous injury designation, first and foremost issue that leads to actual injury on the field is muscle dysfunction. So muscular imbalances that lead to injuries about joints, muscles, connective tissue, because your body essentially works in concert with itself. So let's take a look at the knee in general. We all worry about ACL. We talk about ACL injury prevention, et cetera. ACL is predominantly affected by weak, tight hamstrings relative to quad strength.
Yep.
So if you are imbalanced from the posterior to the anterior chain in that lower leg, you are more likely to experience ACL damage, rupture, strain, any one of those things because of the additional strain you are placing on it, because of the pull of a hamstring or the lack of a strength, of a hamstring, and the overdeveloped quad dominant strength of the anterior side of the knee. And the knee is operating on with an agonist and an antagonist, and you need both to have proper function, strength, flexibility, mobility. If any one of those things is imbalanced, then you are at a greater risk of injury.
Yeah, and I like that idea in terms of like the different, and I always use the levers or the buckets example of like what you just touched on. Like it could be any number of things. In terms of what you just described, it could be like, you know, so-and-so is struggling with some strength, got great flexibility, or so-and-so's got, you know, no strength whatsoever, great flexibility. And I'm being extreme in the descriptions, but it's, by what you're describing, somewhat more of like that balance of all of those things. And I think what we're going to start to trend towards or, get to is the fact that strength and conditioning can hopefully or possibly serve some of those different buckets in terms of getting to that.
It's never about one thing or another. You know, preventing ACL injury, and the reason I'm focusing on this is you see this everywhere. Where it's here's an ACL prevention program, ACL injury prevention program. Okay, so are we focused on posterior chain development because that seems to be a focal point of the cause, or they've also shown that hip tightness, weakness, the stabilizers within the hip have direct effect on the patellofemoral joint stability, which is then going to also implicate the knee injury in general.
Yeah, and another thing I think you will probably get to, but a part of like the different imbalances that can start to happen is a lot of these things will become imbalanced or start to maybe fall apart as athletes start to get like fatigued or tired or things like that, because I think a lot of times we see people getting hurt when they played back-to-back games, or coming off of a tough practice and then they jump onto the field or whatever it may be. All of a sudden you're in a more compromised position because like your muscles aren't at 100% and you can't do what we're trying to describe to do.
Correct. So it's concretely proven and completely common sense that fatigue, both very specific within the muscle itself and overall central nervous system fatigue, plays a serious, significant role and is directly correlated with the rate of injury or incidence of injury.
Yeah.
Fatigued muscles have less ability to basically control their own action, and thus, one, imbalances can be exacerbated. Two, the imbalances that maybe don't exist because you are strong on both ends, but now your movement is compromised because one of them is not firing the way it should because it is tired. That all plays a very serious role, and there's a reason that they've done tons of studies of like pro soccer in Europe. When and where do injuries occur? It's almost entirely in the second half toward the end of a match. It's obvious, right? The more tired you get or the less resistant to fatigue you are, the more likely you are to eventually get injured one way or another, whether that's a massive ACL injury, small ankle roll, hamstring pull, etc. So fatigue is a huge one. So first, strength. Weak, imbalanced strength, big problem. Second, if you are unable to fight off fatigue or if you're operating within fatigue, you're more likely to get hurt. And then you mentioned before, people make a lot of arguments that like flexibility is no longer important, but there are a lot of research and practical application experience that would tell us that task-specific flexibility is super important. And then I would argue, beyond flexibility, mobility in total, like your ability to move through specific movement patterns with proper mechanics. Again, going back to the ACL, if you can't jump and land with that proper placement of knee-ankle relationship, aka that valgus knee collapse that has basically been proven to be one of the biggest issues or biggest causes of ACL tears in female athletes, it's because when we land, we have a tendency to let the knees collapse
Cave in.
versus keep in that good external rotation of the hip
Yep.
position. That's a big determining factor, and that can happen either because your mechanics are poor, which strength and conditioning can help with, your fatigue is too high, which strength and conditioning can help with, or the muscles that are supporting that joint are not strong enough to actually keep you in the proper position.
Yeah, no, I think those are all good points because, like, even you look, and I watching, football on Sunday, you watch somebody like Saquon Barkley move his body in all sorts of ways,
Yep.
and sometimes not to his own choice because he's getting banged around, and like all of those combinations of things, I look at him as like, that's a really good example. That guy is strong, he's flexible, he's mobile, and he is able to do some things that, someone who might be stiff or this or that have a little bit of struggle with.
Absolutely.
Anything else in kind of considerations before we start to unpack a little bit more?
No, I don't think so. I think it paints a good picture that injury is not something that you specifically say, I'm going to do X to prevent this injury.
Yeah.
It's, I'm going to take care of the risk factors that can cause injury.
Yep.
And I'm going to pair them with all of the things that are improving performance, which guess what? They're very parallel.
Sure.
Or I should say connected.
Yep.
And I'm going to do all of those things such that we're improving performance while also trying to reduce risk of injury through a number of different domains, because you don't know what it's going to be that causes the individual in question an injury in whatever practice or game they might be competing in.
Fair enough. So we're going to take a quick pause. I think that's a good kind of framework that we've set up.
Okay.
And then a lot of the coaches and teachers listening are probably going to say, all right, so what are those domains, or what are we actually getting at? So let's take a quick pause and we'll jump into that on the second half.
Cool.
All right, before we jump back in, just a friendly reminder, go to platform.com. That's pltforum.com. We have lots of great episodes that we've already come out with. I think this is number like 57 or something. There's all sorts of things that we're covering in the world of strength and conditioning, athletics, physical education. Check it out, and that's at platform.com. With that, we'll jump back into the second half of the show. All right, so we did a really great job breaking down sort of the things we're talking about when we talk about injury and why injuries might happen because of all of those different factors that you've outlined. Now we're going to get into those domains within strength and conditioning that actually might be deemed or considered part of that larger term of injury prevention. So let's just go from there and start to kind of unpack that concept. We did injury. Now let's get to the header
the
of
prevention
of it.
Right. Okay. So yeah, that makes sense, because realistically speaking, the long and short of this entire conversation is that good, competent strength and conditioning in general is injury prevention.
Right.
It is pervasive throughout your training.
Right. So it's not, hey, I want the ACL program.
Correct.
It's, hey, I want a strength and conditioning program that's covering a lot of different things and is that holistic approach that we'll get into the specifics of it, where I always say, like, take the highlighter out. You could highlight the whole page if you're doing it the right way.
Which we will do, and we will kind of go through all the different things you can highlight.
Yeah.
And we'll kind of get into the specifics, because there's also very, like, the colloquial sense of injury prevention when people are looking for, like, pre-hab stability and these things that are like, this is what I think of as injury prevention. But I want to just start it off with saying, if you are engaged in consistent and well-balanced, competent strength and conditioning on a regular basis, you are already doing injury prevention at its most important.
Yeah.
Because it's not all that hard to understand. First things first, what is the effect on the body of just training in general? Resistance training literally increases bone density. So your likelihood of breaking a bone is less. So does running, so does throwing. Any action, any stress placed on bone is going to increase its density, but resistance training is the single greatest way. It's the reason that they promote and encourage elderly population to engage in resistance training, because you're going to get the greatest osteogenic aid, aka bone growth. So you're preventing bone injury just by lifting. you are also in the exact same way influencing the strength and elasticity of connective tissue. So ligaments, tendons, etc. You are actually improving their function within the body, which again, those are they are the most important parts of the body realistically when it comes to movement and injury prevention, because they're what holds everything together.
Right.
At the same time, they're probably the most vulnerable. So
We can go from platform for high school seniors to senior citizens. That could be our second wave of
yes, exactly. So you actually increase collagen content by engaging in resistance training, and that's going to be something that's going to actually improve the function and strength of all of that connective tissue. Again, another reason that, athletes want it, but so do middle-aged folks and elderly folks, because it's something that is, again, preventing any sort of decrease in health or performance.
Yeah.
And then lastly, obviously, we talked about it. If you strength train, you're going to increase the size and strength of the muscles at play, which are obviously important implications for preventing that muscle dysfunction, imbalance, weakness. You want to make sure you have a strong, flexible hamstring versus a tight, weak hamstring.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean just static stretching. I'm saying, a muscle that can move through an entire range of motion while applying force, aka eccentric loading, concentric loading, and all that good stuff.
Well, I think that's important too, because I think a lot of people, probably not so much now as maybe 5-10 years ago, would be like, strength is strength, like you talked about, and mobility and flexibility isn't as important. But it's like, well, if you have super strong muscles, but they can only get you so far, because the second you're put in a compromised position or you try to go any further in that range of motion, you're feeling like you're going to snap, you're in trouble.
Right. And then the really cool thing is that then we say, okay, well then mobility is the most important. Well, what are some of the best ways to improve mobility? Load a movement up and go through the entire range of motion. So full depth squatting under load is one of the single greatest ways to improve mobility and flexibility. And so it's all one big thing. And we say that all the time, is if you just take care of a well-balanced approach to training, aka you do take care of strength, you focus on mobility, you care about mechanics, you develop some sort of capacity, and all of these things, you are going to work towards that common goal of injury prevention, even if you're only thinking of it as performance enhancement or whatever the case may be. So the summary there would be that we know what training does from an adaptation standpoint for performance, but it also is very much similarly responding to training from an injury prevention standpoint in all the same mechanisms, right? The muscle strength and size, the bone density, connective tissue, all the things that we would think of from a performance enhancement standpoint is also very important from a injury prevention standpoint.
Yeah, and I think that makes a good case too for like why sometimes a lot of times in-season programs will get like kind of the tagline of one of the main focuses is injury prevention.
Yes.
And it might not be within the program itself, but like the reason why you're continuing in-season training is because you don't want to lose that muscle and you don't want to lose that mobility that you're getting from strength and conditioning as you're competing in a season. Because as those things decline, if you just nix it out of your 12 weeks or 16 weeks, you're going to start to lose some of that stuff, and then we'll get into those other parts.
Yeah, without a doubt. I think, honestly, we could probably condense this entire episode into make sure you do strength and conditioning, because the research has proven that if you do, you will dramatically reduce the potential rate of injury amongst your athletes on the field. Yeah. So there was one study. This is all over the place. But
I asked and Devin Wendell, who listens to this, who's a athletic director, athletic trainer, has coached, and I had asked him like, hey, do you want to do an article on injury prevention? And to his credit, was like, I mean, there's about a billion things out there that I could write about.
Google it.
And then his article, what his article ended up being was like the 11 benefits of strength and conditioning, and had a really good focus of like, everybody wants healthy players. Here it is. This will do it. Go read the studies, because there's about a million.
Yeah, we're talking about like girl soccer players that were engaged in strength and conditioning were 62% less likely to be injured. We're talking about any the huge group of high school athletes, if you're engaged in training both in season, off season, you are 3 times less likely, or you're only 25% likely to be injured in a sport if you're engaged in strength and conditioning. You are 75% likely. So if you are not, you're 3 times more likely to be injured in some form, whether that's a small hamstring strain or an ACL tear, if you are engaged or not engaged in strength and conditioning. So bottom line, good training, consistent training, far less injury.
Yeah. So that's a good case for just strength and conditioning in general. Something you alluded to earlier, though, and it's still something that I like, even as I'll use swimming as the example, because we've talked soccer, football, and we all know I love my swimming, is like, I see all the time kids at meets, kids at practices, bring out the bands and start to do like, the internal rotation, external rotation, and that feels like almost like the prehab stuff that they're looking for in like the specific little like that circled. Hey, I get you're saying strength and conditioning in its totality is great for me, but because of my sport or because of what I do, I want some specific prehab stuff. Like where does that fit into all of this?
Well, yeah, it's just a larger part of the entire pie. So when you are creating a program for athletics, performance enhancement aside, you are going to try to tick off a lot of different boxes. And one of them is things that we can just label as prehab or overt, injury prevention, where that's like your main goal for providing that particular piece. But it's not just, that's not where injury prevention only lives. And it's also not saying that if you do that, you will prevent injury. Right. You've got to do a lot of different things. So we'll get into all those like, mobility pieces or prehab type things. But, every one of our workouts will say, okay, we're going to have some, prehab as well as core activation, aka stability, for not just the benefit of that injury prevention on the field, but we want to make sure that we are prepared for the movement in the gym. So it's serving 2 purposes. Yep. We're getting warmed up and activated for a movement that's going to make us stronger, which is also going to reduce injury. Those things in and of themselves will also reduce injury over time because we've prepared ourselves with very specific, plans of attack. But if you push and you pull, if you do eccentric training, if you take care of capacity work, if you work power development, if you work plyometrics so that you know how to take off and land, all of those things within your workout are also injury prevention. So these little elements that we'll talk about next are by no means the injury prevention, but I know a lot of people are kind of curious, like, what is the role of what we think of as prehab? And
I think that's a great example of like the landing mechanics one. Like that in its most basic form, as we think of what we just described, there's a lot of times people will land in a compromised position. Yeah. And sometimes, like we've talked about, you can't control that. You're hit, you're bumped, you're this, or you're that. But there are a lot of instances where, like, especially because we're talking about high school athletes, who don't know how to land properly, even just on their own accord, let alone with outside stimulus or other people touching them.
Correct.
They don't even know how to do it just within their own body.
Yeah.
So those types of things I think are super valuable to outline, to show, to highlight in terms of what you just said. Like, people do start to look at, like, well, what about the prehab stuff? And I think that's where we'll go. But there's plenty of other places that, like, just know.
Well, and I would even argue that those are really the most important. We might label prehab or injury prevention sections in a workout and say this is where it's the most obvious. I don't even think that we could say that it is even proportionally as important as if you just really get good at competent movement under load, squatting, pressing, hinging, pulling. You are doing the bulk of your injury prevention.
For sure.
I think the strength piece, connective tissue piece, bone density piece from just loading up movement is the single greatest. And then I actually say, we mentioned it earlier and we haven't really talked about it a ton, is if you are not resistant to fatigue, you are far more likely to be injured. So making sure that you condition appropriately for your sport, And again, that's not as wildly specific as everybody really likes to think and argue about it. You have to be well conditioned through a lot of different domains, time domains, intensity domains, maximal effort to really low effort over long periods of time, because you never know what's going to be asked of you, and you're never only pigeonholed into one type of activity.
Sure.
So that if you are unready for that 1 3-minute period in which you did not prepare for, all of a sudden there's your risk for injury.
Yep.
The biggest piece really is the meat and potatoes of workouts. So when you're working on your strength, AKA your squats and your lifts, your power lifts, you are preventing injury.
Yep.
When you're working power, AKA plyometrics or Oles, your deceleration, your mechanics, you are preventing injury.
Yep.
When you are doing any sort of conditioning, maximal effort, speed, sprint work, or more aerobic capacity type work, you are preventing injury. And I think those are really where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck, so long as you push as often as you pull. People would argue you should pull more. You do eccentric training just as often as you do concentric, and you're not ignoring one or the other.
Yep.
If you do those things, you are really taking care of it.
For sure. And I think that is a good stamp on the head, and a good, I think sometimes we say don't take the sound bites. That's a good sound bite. I think you could take that one to the bank.
Sure.
For your bang for your buck
okay
moment. We can take that sound bite out and clip that one there. So I think a good summary in and of itself. Let's just quickly, or not so quickly, talk about just like what sometimes people put into that little like bucket of the true like prehab stuff, just so we address it, we talk about it with, again, I think you've done a good job setting up that there's all those other things as well.
Yeah, please. And we do this too, so understand there is a reason to identify certain types of training within a workout, and often we will call part of our warm-up the injury prevention piece, or we'll add injury prevention elements to a warm-up. And it's for a number of different reasons. It's because those are the most obvious. It's also because they also have elements of preventing injury in the workout to come up. So there's a reason that we call it that, and they are also important. So they're not important.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's good to note, is that in our programs and the programs you deliver with your own kids, you're highlighting the injury prevention aspects to it as well, prehab, whatever else. It's not like we're saying don't call it that because everything is it. We still highlight those different parts. So what do you highlight sometimes, or what are the things that fit what you're describing there?
I would look at it as kind of mobility, stability, and coordination. All of the things that we look at is from like a movement perspective.
Yep.
And mobility is basically the degree to which an articulation, aka your joint, can move before being restricted by the surrounding tissue.
Yeah.
So if you have immobility or you have a mobility issue, it means that something is compromising a joint's ability to move through a proper range of motion, which everything we just talked about would basically be alarm going off, like potential injury if asked to do something in a stressful environment. So we do a lot of things like end range stretching. Look, muscle strains have been proven to be reduced, or the risk of muscle strains have been proven to be reduced by consistent and religious static stretching.
Yeah.
I know that we've done our thing on static versus dynamic. You can utilize static stretching on a regular basis to reduce the risk of potential strain both in a workout and over time, and you can mitigate any potential loss of performance in a workout, aka lower strength or power. Again, we've done all that. That's not necessarily even true, but you can also prove that or guarantee that it's not going to affect your workout by doing other dynamic elements.
Sure.
Static stretching super important, but so is I'm a big fan of, and we're going to do a lot more of this coming soon with our mobility expert on staff, which is tissue mashing and activation, turning on muscles that are supposed to be working during a given movement. You might think you are activating them. Gluteal activation before you're doing things like squats are important for that workout, but it's also important to make sure that your brain, the neuromuscular connection, is on, such that external hip rotation is, one, complete, and two, done by the right muscles. Because if you compensate, right, we talked about this, muscular imbalances are a big problem, and sometimes that's not even a strength issue, it's an ability to use the muscle issue.
Yeah, and we talked a lot about that in the warm-up episode. That's a good one to probably go check out, in terms of like all of the different things that almost have to get like turned on.
Yeah, absolutely. And for all the disbelievers out there, I have literally sat on tables because of back issues and been tested, okay, they isolate just the glute. They're like, I want you to resist movement. I can't move my leg at all. We do one activation and all of a sudden I'm an freaking steel rod. and you can understand that. And it's also the reason that like much back pain issues are often associated with inhibitions in certain muscles, overcompensation in others. We know that. We talked about Sammy's squat the other day. He's always had low back pain. It's not because of his hips, it's because of his upper back.
Yeah.
Right? So it's always about understanding that the way movement is intended to happen is not just the eyeball test, is making sure that what is generating movement internally is the right thing.
Yeah.
Very hard to do, understand, you're not going to correct everybody's everything all the time, but the more you can move towards proper movement, the right activation of the right muscles in the right movement patterns, the less likely you are to have problems down the road from overuse, overcompensation injury.
Yeah, and I like that. And what you're referencing to, which I'm going to put into the blog, and I think it's a very, very cool video, is working with Sammy Cleveland, one of the platform guys on our staff, was basically struggling with some of his squat mobility. Right. And I think I personally, and I think a lot of coaches would immediately think, because squat depth is an issue, hips, right? Oh, their hips aren't mobile enough. And that could be the case, but like this video is really cool and you did a good job identifying like it's actually some other things that are issues up top and down below, ankles, like upper back and like those types of things. Okay, we've identified it. Now we got some things to start working on in terms of mobility or anything else like that. And now he's not going to be in this strained position as much and at risk of injury because he's not moving as well.
Exactly. And I think that's important, is just correcting movement, enhancing movement, improving movement is always super important. So that was a really long-winded way of me saying that mobility is a big thing for us, from SMR to static stretching to activation type techniques. That's a very important thing. Stability is that next piece. It's, again, this is all very overlapped. So
sure.
I'm doing my best here to
you're good.
Separate them, but they are very much overlapped. We're really talking from mobility is, what range of motion can we get through successfully? Stability is our ability to maintain control in a specific position or through the range of motion. So what strength can we apply through that range of motion?
Yep.
And that's all about what are the, strength and coordination abilities of all of the surrounding tissue, about maybe your hip joint, your knee joint, your ankle joint. When, if you have a really weak, as we talked about, hamstring, your knee mobility might be fine. You might be able to move through all the range of motion. But if you are unable to stabilize that joint with strength when it is stressed, then you're at risk of injury. We've talked about that with all the ACL stuff. So how do we work that? We do a lot of different things, from balance training, which is really just unilateral work, requiring a joint to work on its own under some sort of stress and load, whether that's a single leg squat on a box or even just simple lunges go a long way. They might seem like it's not all that fancy, but anything on one leg, one arm is really great because it's requiring stability through very just isolated joint areas, but still compound movements. And then stability, I think, in the most overt sense of the word, we like to think of in core stability. So this one is even, they've dove into this a lot. It's proven that the better you are, the more stable and strong you are, from, think of like the bottom of your butt cheek up to the bottom of your rib cage, the less likely you are to injure yourself specifically from the waist down to your lower extremities. So they've basically shown hip, low back, ab strength is wildly important in prevention of injury. Your spine is essentially intended to resist movement, right? The core is supposed to keep your spine stable, I should say. It also does initiate movement, so we want to do both of those things, from planks, whether that be activation of a core before a heavy movement, or just the development of core strength over time, so that when you're on the field, it is kind of holding up its end of the bargain in terms of all of the crazy movement you do. So we're talking planks, RDLs, good mornings, fire hydrants, the ability to strengthen the hip, the abs, the hip flexors, the erectors, all of those things need to be shored up. And it's often that athletes will be either dominant because all they ever do is sit-ups and never good mornings or never RDLs. I'd argue that the reverse is just as bad, and everybody that says posterior chain is the ultimate, yes, the ultimate fix if you haven't fixed it. Don't do it at the exclusion of everything else.
Yep.
So I think all of those things are super, super important.
For sure.
And then you have the mobility, the range of motion, you have the strength through the range of motion, and then can you coordinate all of those things together so that your movement is proper?
Yeah.
So we do things like PVC overhead squats so that you can combine complex movements together. You might use the agility ladder. I know it's crapped on a lot, but it might be something that we are just working kind of more high skilled movements so that your body's requiring complex movement all put together so that it knows the connections between brain and feet and brain and knee and brain and hip and all these other things. Balance, rhythm, all of those things that we might use in an unloaded environment that are more warm up. You could use them at any point in the workout, but we load them all into kind of the similar, time frame of the beginning of a workout because plyometrics are unbalanced, loading, deceleration, and all that good stuff as well.
Great. So that's like all of the different things in terms of like what can sometimes fall under that bucket of like injury prevention or prehab. And you'll typically, by your description, find that sort of towards the beginning of a workout. Is that fair?
That's where I like to kind of label it.
Yeah.
Again, even in my specific labeling of it could theoretically probably be overlapped throughout, and I might place it in different areas. But a lot of time it's easiest to think of like those things are kind of warm-up related. And honestly, and the reason we do it is it's a really good way to warm up and take care of the things that are going to prevent injury in the gym that day, maximize performance in the gym that day, as well as over time add up to preventative effect on the field.
Great. So I think that's a good description of what those things start to like fit into. We've done a good job navigating injury prevention in the biggest sense of the word, what it looks like in strength and conditioning, and then what it looks like within a certain day or within a certain workout when we are looking to kind of like really focus in on why we're doing it. So where do you want to kind of put the stamp on it or wrap up in just kind of like a general summary of this conversation?
I'd say that the easiest way to think about injury prevention and strength and conditioning is that from a long-term standpoint, injury reduction strategies really parallel the same tenets of general performance enhancement. Warm up well before you do anything, right? Because an adequate warm-up will increase range of motion, muscle temperature, elasticity, all of those things, increase force production and energy absorption, all of those things that you want from performance, and also making sure that you don't put yourself at risk for injury. And then over time, if you improve your stability, task-specific flexibility, are you going to be able to withstand the things you ask your body to do from a movement perspective, stability perspective? Big piece for me is, have you developed a work capacity, both cardiovascularly, muscular endurance side of things, movement, dynamic energy expenditure? Can you control your movement when fatigued? All of those things. Can you delay the results of fatigue that lead to injury, which we've talked about? All of those things from poor movement to reduced function muscularly to just poor cardiovascular ability.
Yep.
The one that we don't really even need to talk about much is, have you improved strength in all areas? Well balanced, pressing and pulling, both lower and upper. Are you taking care of all the things so that you don't have a major imbalance between front and back, top and bottom, right and left?
Yep.
Imbalance and dysfunction are one of the biggest drivers of those hamstring strains, rotator cuff strains, those in the moment kind of overuse. They became an injury because we've pushed it to a point where it just can't handle it anymore. And then I think is proper progression. Not jumping in too early to anything, the same way we wouldn't throw athletes into their first practice of the year as the most intense, hardest, although unfortunately that often is the case.
Right, because it's tryout and everybody wants to figure.
If you want to prevent injury, let's build up. to where we want to be, because we want to make sure that proper recovery is considered. This is from a training perspective, this is from a practice perspective, this is from a game perspective. It's proper warm-up and activity within a practice, proper progression within a season, a training program, etc. So all of the same things that you would think about from performance enhancement should be the same considerations you have from an injury prevention standpoint. I'd argue, think of both always. Don't think of one and the other. Think, what can I get done with a heavy squat today? What are the goals today? It's not just strength for speed. It's strength. It's injury prevention. It's X, Y, and Z else.
Yeah.
Same thing with, we talk about finishers in our workouts. Yeah, they're fun, and they make it competitive, so kids will actually show up and kind of get into it.
Yeah.
2, very important from a performance standpoint, but maybe even more important is the reduction in potential fatigue-related injuries when they get then on the field, if they have built up that resistance over time. So
yeah, and I think that's a good point too, because
it's a lot of things.
Because in that same sense, a lot of times, and to go back to, we've talked about it in previous myths and different podcasts about baseball and repeated throwing motions. Swimming follows the same thing of repeated shoulder, agitating those things. Where I always go to, and it makes sense, is doing it in a weight room in a controlled environment while fatigued, building up muscular endurance and all of those other things. If you can't do it there, then when you're exhausted or you're fatigued or anything else in competition or in practice, you're not going to really be able to do it there either, and you're going to put yourself in a compromised position. I think
far greater one. Yeah.
Right. I think the benefits of strength and conditioning is that controlled space and environment, even in finishers, of hey, we're moving, you're fatigued, but every single time you go from shoulder to overhead, you're in those controlled positions. And I'm just using that one as an example.
No, absolutely.
You could do all sorts of others as well.
100%.
Translates over to the person who's well, I haven't done any of that, and now I'm expecting my body to be able to know I'm here, I'm locked in, I'm moving, and things start to fall apart pretty quickly.
Absolutely.
Anything else?
No, I think just one small note at the end is that obviously there becomes a very big difference in which one of those things you select during a season, during an off season. How do you prepare for one, and then how do you keep athletes healthy during one? We've done those podcasts before,
yep.
So obviously, check those out. What is the difference between in-season and off-season training most traditionally? Why? Because it's all one big equation, but it might kind of change which variables are priorities at different times of the year,
yep.
And different experience levels and so forth.
For sure. And then the one caveat I will put in from not a liability perspective or anything else like that, but you made mention to it of, injuries themselves when they do happen. It's not the strength and conditioning coach. It is the athletic trainer.
Yes.
It's a doctor. It's whoever is in charge of those types of things, both in the return to play, both in the, what can they be doing in and out of the weight room. I think that's an important thing to remember, is that as a strength and conditioning coach, a weights teacher, a PE teacher, a sport coach that's in the weight room, you're doing all of these things in the hopes to prepare your athletes to be their very best when they do compete. But when and if something does happen, it's not necessarily going to fall right back onto you.
No, and you want somebody that's there that is solely invested in getting kids back to complete health, not just getting them to the point where they can play again, so that you don't have that additional risk factor
yep.
that we talked about.
Yep.
All that being said, it's always teamwork. So if you have a great athletic trainer and you are in the weight room, you always defer to them with regards to rehab
sure.
and return to play.
Yep.
But you can certainly help expedite the process if they go, hey, coach, here's what I want this athlete doing. Can you oversee it? 1,000%. They've, return from ACLs, there's a lot of eccentric training to promote all of the re-strengthening of the joint. You can help with that. Once they get cleared, then you have to make sure that you are being appropriately progressive in, hey, let's get you back to really moving well so that everything is perfect. Let's make sure you feel comfortable in the gym again. Then we start loading things up. But we're also not going to baby you, because we just talked about, if you don't work out for a long period of time because of an injury, and then you go play again, what have you completely missed on? All of that muscular strength that goes towards battling imbalances, mm-hmm. all those movement mechanic items that we deal with that you might actually be more likely to injure yourself because
yep.
you haven't done the training, which again we mentioned. So it's really that joint piece. But yes, always defer to the medical professionals when it comes to injury. because you want them gone for the least amount of time.
For sure. Awesome. And we're going to wrap up there. A great kind of overview of injury prevention, ways in which it overlaps with the world of strength and conditioning. As you know, the big picture here is we want the very best for the kids we work with. We want them to stay healthy, and you know, both in and out of the weight room, there's some great things that we can be doing. So we're gonna hit the stop button on this podcast. Go check out more at platform.com, and as always, reach out to us with questions. I feel like a broken record saying it, but we do have more people starting to reach out to us, which is nice.
And I appreciate it.
And we do appreciate it, and it fuels these conversations more and more. So with that, I'll wrap up. And remember, at Platform, it's always in pursuit of better.